Welcome to the Classical Architecture Workshop. My name is Professor Brandon Rowe, and today we will be discussing ornament in architecture. I'll be giving a brief introduction to this topic. The structure of this presentation will consist of how we can gain a better understanding of ornament in architecture. First, we'll look at what is ornament. We'll define it. Then we'll look at the why. What is the purpose of including ornament on architecture? From there, we'll proceed to when do you use ornament and what are its particular categories? Next, we will identify where ornament should be placed. And then finally, we'll look at how ornament can be designed and applied. Let's begin with a quote from Michelangelo. He says, "Do not neglect small things, for that is where perfection is found, and perfection is no small thing." Ornament, writes Stephen Semmes in his book The Architecture of the Classical Interior, may be defined as the architecture of the near view. Take this example from the Utah State Capitol, for instance. We've got a photograph, and as we zoom in to specific elements, lighting fixture in particular, we find more and more detail. It is truly the architecture of the near view. And as Michelangelo said, we should pay attention to small things. Ornament comes from the Latin verb ornare, which means to confer honor or grace, to dress, to equip, to decorate, furnish, adorn, garnish, trim, embellish, or to beautify. Another way that we might define ornament comes from Dennis McNamara. He writes that ornament might be referred to as an enrichment of a building in order to reveal a building's use or purpose. So, for instance, we might encounter a portal in a Gothic cathedral with an image of Christ. That ornament reflects to us and reveals the building's use and purpose. Or find a crucifix on a steeple or in stained glass. Another term that is often confused with ornament is what we might call decoration. Decoration, he defines, is an enrichment of architecture that adds beauty by making the structural systems at work more legible. In other words, it is a poetic expression of structure. So why should we apply ornament to a building, let's say? Well, if we go back to the Renaissance period, and we learn from Leon Battista Alberti in his book, The 10 Books of Architecture, he writes that it is generally allowed that the pleasure and delight which we feel on the view of any building arise from nothing else but beauty and ornament. He continues, "Beauty will have such an effect even upon an enraged enemy that it will disarm his anger and prevent him from offering it any injury." Close quote. Beauty, we might say, can be found in harmonious relationships of proportions that have stood the test of time. According to Plato, He says that beauty is the sign of another and higher order. Close quote. So, another way we might view beauty is that it is found in the traditions that we pass down from generation to generation, which shape a particular culture. So, as we consider when to use ornament, we turn to the varying classifications of it with its respective functions. So, for instance, if we're trying to convey something that is, say, symbolic or allegorical, such as the celebration of a mythico-historical person, place, or event, we turn to ornament to reinforce a building's purpose. The same could be said of using ornament as a mnemonic strategy to convey learning and understanding. It could remind us or teach onlookers something by using lettering, patterns, or other memory devices. And lastly, we use ornament if we want to add to the aesthetic quality of a space or object and enhance its atmosphere or ambiance through the use of decor. Take, for instance, some of the rich details that can be found in Chicago and the various messages and meanings that are conveyed through architectural ornament. This reminds me of a quote by Kent Bloomer in his book, The Nature of Ornament. He says, quote, "This language of ornament, like the languages of speech and music, must be nourished by active procedures of renewal and education. There is simply not enough time within each successive generation of designers and artisans to reinvent the complex grammar and visual eloquence that are manifest in the most outstanding projects from the past." So, how do we nourish and learn this language of ornament? One way is by learning about the various categories of ornament. So after we consider this question of when to use ornament, we begin to look at what types of ornament should be used. An ornament in itself can be broken down into 7 categories: human, animal, botanical, man-made, geometric, typography, and a hybrid, which usually comprises 2 or more of the above. So let's look at a couple of examples. First, let's start with the human. As we consider ornament with human depictions, we see here that ornament is in many instances applied to the frieze area of an entablature in a classical order on the facade of a building. From maidens gathering wheat stalks to allegorical or symbolic depictions of Adam and Eve, or to celebratory scenes of ancient Roman festivals. All of this can be described as part of human ornament and depictions. It is also one of the highest and grandest orders of architectural ornament in itself. Next, we have the category of animals. When we find animals in architectural ornament, we can find anywhere from typical sacrificial animals, like in the frieze there on the left, or we can find mythic animals, like a sphinx, as well as lions. We can find depictions of dragons, of sheep and rams, to flying horses or unicorns. or griffins. We can also see these animals in various cultures from around the world, from elephants in India to dragons in China. And all of these elements are used in various ways to convey meaning and messages. Next, we move on to the botanical. In the botanical, we find lots of patterns, vegetal motifs. Specifically in the classical tradition, we usually see the use of the acanthus leaf. It is very much symbolic and similar to the use of the lotus that is found in the Eastern traditions. And usually it's symbolic of renewal, rebirth, resurrection. But we can see other vegetal motifs and how repetitive patterns can be applied to the area of the frieze in the entablature, to sculptural patterns, to decorative paint. And here we find some other examples, more sculptural qualities, with artists working in clay, stone, and plaster. When we consider the category of man-made objects, what comes to mind? Well, a lot of man-made objects we might describe as musical instruments if we're celebrating a specific purpose of a building, let's say an opera house or a symphony hall. But what about more civic buildings that may celebrate victories in war? We might have weapons, shields, swords, axes, scimitars. Other man-made objects might include machinery or crowns, shields, royal crests. What about even the compass itself? Here, between the triglyphs on this entablature, you can see that they're using various man-made objects with symbolic meaning. Next, we move on to the geometric. In the geometric, we find various patterns, starting with the most basics from circles, squares, but then more complex patterns, such as the meander or the galoche. Here we can see some of those patterns. Or the wave scroll, or the Greek key. All of these geometric patterns can be easily applied to various elements within classical architecture. The next type of architectural ornament is what we might describe as mnemonic or typography. Deals specifically with lettering, the written word, codes, abbreviations. Here we see featured the Pantheon. We see other inscriptions about dates, words representing concepts and themes important for a specific building, like equality, justice under the law, or in monuments dedicated to a specific person, place, or event. Whether it's religious or political. And last but not least, we have hybrid methods of ornament. So here on the left, you have an example. You've got the zodiacal constellations depicted in their allegorical symbols. Other examples include vegetal motifs as well as human figures or even man-made objects like the lyre. Here's more complex examples where vegetation is mingled with animals and human beings or gods or goddesses. Yet further examples show that how these themes can be intertwined with one another. From busts and foliating scrolls to sacrificial animals to cherubs, urns and vases, or even to dolphins, or using ornament to take the sense of architectural elements, such as brackets supporting this area above the church and the rose window, from mystical beasts to human figures. All of this leads us to think about a quote by George Santayana. He says, "A building without ornament is like the heavens without stars." As we begin to address the question about where ornament should be placed or located on a building, there are a couple of points to consider. The first off, we should be reminded that classical architecture in and of itself, whether it's the columns themselves or the moldings, they all have an anthropomorphic connection. Here is an example from Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who said, having measured very many other cornices of buildings, I have found plenty which do have the proportion of a head. And so as you're thinking about the placement of ornament, you might think of its anthropomorphic connections. In classical architecture in general, moldings are the standard alphabet, which typically consists of 14 to 15 standard varieties, which are depicted here. A simple analysis of the shape is how moldings are classified. So they are either concave, convex, planar or just plain surfaces, or compound. These moldings in general are ideal locations to place various ornamental patterns. Though all moldings can be decorated in some way, explains Richard Sammons, their sectional profile typically places limits on what is successful visually, as well as what can be economically carved or applied. He continues, because of the geometry and greater amount of actual material, ornamental patterns for convex moldings tend to be carved into the section. Decorations on concave moldings project from the surface of the profile. For instance, take the egg and dart pattern. This is most commonly applied to the ovolo. And then the leaf and dart pattern is applied to the cyma reversa moldings. Here is a great example of how these standard patterns could be applied to the molding profiles of the Corinthian entablature. At the top, we have the running wave. On the cyma recta, we have a vegetal motif with various acanthus leaf configurations. On the ovolo, we have an egg and dart. On the bead, right below that, we have a bead and reel molding. There in the frieze, that flat fascia area, we have a sculptural relief with humans and man-made objects. Right below that, on a cyma reversa mold, we have a vegetal motif with an enthymeme. Below that, a bead and reel, Then we have a flat fascia, and then another cyma reversa with the leaf and dart. And then below that, another fascia, and then finally we have terminating with a bead and reel. Another point to consider is this quote by Leon Battista Alberti. He says, quote, "I shall define beauty to be a harmony of all the parts, in whatsoever subject it appears, fitted together with such proportion and connection that nothing could be added, diminished, or altered, but for the worse." Here's a great example of Alberti's quote. We might look at this proportional relationships between various elements in a room design. They're all relating to one another, whether it's the cornice, the entire wall elevation, the dado, or the wainscot, and even the door architrave. Stephen Sams argues that classical ornament should be understood as an articulation of form, an elaboration of finely scaled constituent parts. In other words, ornament fails when its own proportions and composition do not mirror those of the work as a whole. So going back to Alberti's quote, beauty is found when there are these proportional relationships at all scales. As one begins the design process, we are reminded of a wonderful architect, Louis Sullivan. He designed exquisite architectural ornament by learning from his observations of nature as well as geometrical forms. He began with his observations of, say, the natural world, such as plant growth, and how the organic shapes could then be manipulated. Then he combined that knowledge with studies of geometric shapes and patterns, what we might call the inorganic. Another approach for designing vegetal ornamental motifs would be to study the morphology, or the form of various flora and plants. We might look at their venation or the bases. From here, one could then proceed on to study plant growth patterns, and specifically how those patterns might then be applied in, say, repetitive patterns. Here is a plate from an old pattern book on architectural ornament. In this example, you can see how basic shapes could be refined over a process to include the various folds, the leaf patterns, and even the veining on each of these vegetal motifs. Here are a couple of exquisite examples of recent ornamental design by the Chicago-based architect Matthew McNicholas. When I look at these designs, I'm reminded of a phrase that I often teach my students, and that is, beauty is found in the details of ornament, and therefore it is a crime to design without ornament. So I leave you with this last quote by Stephen Sams. He writes, "It is virtually impossible to invent a new system of ornament, just as it is virtually impossible to invent a new language. Ornament works like grammar, its forms drawing life from their repetition and subtle variation, while remaining grounded in memories and recognizable models." Thank you for joining us on this short introduction to ornament in architecture.